Welcome to the World of DaaS, a show for data enthusiasts. I'm your host, Auren Hoffman, CEO of SafeGraph and GP of Flex Capital. For more conversations, videos, and transcripts, visit safegraph.com/podcasts. Hello, fellow data nerds. My guest today is Johnathan Bi. Johnathan is the host of a fantastic 7-part lecture series on the work of the philosopher René Girard. He's also a member of the founding team of Opto Investments. Johnathan, welcome to World of DaaS.
Thanks for having me. I think we've been friends now for about 4 to 5 years since I initially reached
quite a long
out.
time.
So
I think you were in college then.
Yeah, I was in college. I reached out, so I'm excited to do this.
Now, I super love that your lecture series on René Girard. Can you explain the difference between kind of like the physical and metaphysical desire?
Yeah, sure. So this is one of my, I think, contributions to the scholarship. I don't know many other people who read Girard this way, but I read Girard as essentially saying that we have two species of human desire that we're motivated by. One is the physical species, and by physical, he just means that it's actually being pointed at a real object or real experience. And the other part, the complement to that, is the metaphysical part, which is what we want objects to say about us. So the physical species of desire is aimed at the utility of an object, whereas the metaphysical desire is aimed at what an object says about me. So
So a car gets me someplace, but a Ferrari shows that I'm a cool dude or something.
Right, exactly. And I think this cuts across so many of our verticals, right? Be it mate selection, be it the companies we build, be it the car, it's your example, be it the restaurants we choose to eat at. So this is one of Girard's key insights. But yeah, so I'm glad you caught on to that.
And most brands, if you think of a brand, connotes something, connotes a metaphysical desire. It's not just the reason why a brand is valuable is that it's not just the physical piece of what you're buying. There's a metaphysical piece that you're buying into some sort of story as well.
And I think this varies between brand to brand, right? There are clearly brands like Walmart, where I imagine not a lot of people gain a lot of status or sort of self-satisfaction by shopping at Walmart. But there are certain brands which go the exact opposite direction, right? And the example I believe my interlocutor, David, gave was Kanye's sort of $300 white T-shirts, where these were just regular white T-shirts, I think just slapped with his label on, and suddenly they became these extremely alluring objects.
Yeah, well, I mean, many brands are like that. I mean, even if you think of the $5,000 bottle wine, like, is it really better than the $40 bottle wine? Like, probably not, right? But there's something about it that we tell a story to ourselves that allows us to go there.
And I think that's a very interesting point that you bring up, that we tell a story to ourselves. One of Girard's observations, and this might seem like a very trivial observation, right? Physical, metaphysical, what's so interesting about this? Well, one reason it's interesting, Girard thinks, is because we tend to hide this from ourselves. That we don't really want to admit to ourselves that what we're really after for is some type of being. And that we were constantly telling a lie, or maybe our subconscious is a good way to approximate this, is constantly trying to tell a lie to ourselves that, like, we're really after the object, that the object really is that good. When we, for example, buy Kanye's white T-shirts, I mean, maybe some of the more cynical and psychopathic of us among us do think, hey, I'm buying this for social prestige. But a lot of the times when we get enamored by a shiny object, we genuinely do desire that shiny object, even when we don't supposed to, right? So the interesting part,
but part of the reason we might desire it is because we want to convince other people that we're cool.
Yeah. No, that's right. I guess I'm saying, but in addition to that, Girard thinks most of the times we've sort of bought into the lie as well, and that's why the desire seems to be pointed at the object.
Is there is some sort of relationship with this kind of desire and Girard's theories with the placebo effect of, in some ways, us tricking ourselves? We take a sugar pill, and because we believe so much in the story, we trick ourselves and it makes us feel better.
That's interesting. I haven't thought about that. That's an interesting connection. I'll have to mull on that a bit more. But one of the interesting aspects of Girard's theory, and this is going to introduce a new thing other than physical and metaphysical desires, this idea of mimesis, right? And mimesis is a central component of Girard's theory, and it's basically our ability to share experiences with other people, to imitate the actions of others. And so what mimetics makes humans become is, there's constantly the story that humans are truth-seeking creatures, right? That what defines us is our ability to reason, to build telescopes. But I think Girard would say, look, animals have a lot of truth-seeking behaviors as well, right? They have echolocation, they tap into magnetic fields, they have night vision. But humans are the only ones who sort of create gods, right? Who would trade food and shelter, real physical things, for pieces of paper. And so for Girard, because of mimesis, we are these creatures not who are defined by our ability to seek truth, but our ability to believe in lies insofar as we look around and other people do as well. And so I'm trying to tie this into the placebo effect, because the placebo is kind of spinning an individual lie to yourself, right? So
Yep.
I'm trying to play on your thoughts there. I don't
And
know if that makes sense.
there's a study that one of my favorite studies is Advil versus ibuprofen, right? We know it's the same thing. And when they did a study where people took them blind and they had the same effect. But when people take Advil versus ibuprofen and they see the bottle and they can see the difference, Advil actually does perform better. And it's this, you're kind of buying into this lie, you're buying into this brand, and it actually tricks your body. So it actually does work. And then there was this other study, Advil versus the same bottle of Advil, it just said 30% off. And the full priced Advil actually worked better than the one 30% off. Again, buying into that lie that paying more must be worth more valuable.
Yeah. And I think this is, we're tapping into what I'm trying to articulate of Girard's view of human nature, that we're really narrative-driven creatures, right? I think it would be ridiculous to find a corollary in the animal world.
Yeah.
Or much more difficult, or certainly at least the abilities for humans to see what's untrue, if that makes sense, is much stronger than it seems than other animals.
Why do you think so many people? Because sometimes you'll be in one of those late night discussions with your friends, and these types of things come up: the value of art or the value of these types of things, and people will so ferociously fight the fact that they're influenced by brand or they're influenced by other people. Why do you think people have such a hard time just believing or at least coming to terms with some of these theories?
Yeah, I think there's probably two answers to this. One is something consistent within human nature, and the other is something contingent with our historical circumstance. So the consistent thing within human nature is the one I think I pointed out already, that we sort of usually deceive ourselves into thinking that the object really is valuable.
Yeah,
that makes sense. So the best example I can give you of this is in romance, right? I mean, I think we've all experienced the phenomenon where a previously unappealing prospect suddenly becomes so much more appealing
because someone else desires them.
Exactly, because we realize that they become super desirable. And well, that's a great example, because clearly the object, in this case the partner, has not changed at all. But your desire has 3x. So clearly your desire is not pointing at anything within the object itself. But as anyone who has experienced such a phenomenal experience will tell you, you don't think like that. You don't think, I like this person now because this other person likes this person. No, that person just appears much more appealing intrinsically. And so this goes back to the point of what we began our discussions today on, that we tend to lie to ourselves about this metaphysical part, and we tend to occlude it and then hide it within the object. So that's the first answer to why people are so resistant to it, because of this natural mechanism. Now, the second reason I would,
and by the way, just to top in, it's the same. In some ways, people don't believe advertising works on them. When they see George Clooney model the watch or something like that, they get, oh, that can't work on me or something like that. But it must work. It seems like it taps into like an innate human desire for all of us to be like George Clooney.
Yeah, totally. I think that's right. And I think what exacerbates this sort of human constancy is this modern idea of the individual. Girard is famously very against this idea of the individual, either this sort of Enlightenment individual who can just use reason to sort of sort things out, or this sort of romantic individual who just has spontaneous desires within him or herself that sort of naturally just sprouts out, right? Think Romeo and Juliet, or the classical conception of Romeo and Juliet. So I think within this our sort of modern individual age, it is much more shameful for us to be a function of other people, right? Let me tell you a story, actually. So my first graduate seminar I took in philosophy, my professor sat me down and said, Johnathan, I want you to do everything that you've done in your undergraduate papers, but with an additional constraint. I want you to write something original, something that people have not said before. And I was like, what an odd requirement. I thought we were philosophers. I thought we were after truth. What if originality, the pursuit of originality, does not lead us to truth? And conversely, what if what is true has already been said before? And in that same semester, I took classes about the Christian theologians, and they were trying to do the exact opposite. They were trying to show what they were saying wasn't original.
Yeah.
Because if it was original, it was heretical. Right. And in fact, if you push it further east and even older, there's this Tibetan tradition within Tibetan Buddhism called the Terma tradition, which is what they call the treasure hunters. And they essentially claim that the Buddha wrote scrolls and hid them in the sort of Himalayan foothills to be discovered in the right moment. So you see how that's an even more extreme intuition, right?
Yeah.
Not only is what I wrote, what I just presented to you, not only is it not original, it's not even me.
Yeah.
So you see how on top of this human constancy, there's a historical change about how legitimate we conceive ourselves to be when we think of ourselves as a function of another person.
Now, when I first, like most people, when I first heard of Girard, it was through Peter Thiel. And it seems like he's kind of like the singular responsible for Girard's philosophy. As far as you know, is Peter kind of like the main Girard apostle?
I think so. I mean, certainly in the public sphere, in the academic realm, Girard is not really taken seriously other than literary theory. And that's only been, I think, in the recent years. We can talk about why that is. But to answer your question directly, yes. And I think there's something interesting about this, which is, a lot of people come to me, and this is how I got into Girard, by the way, which is one of my best friends in high school was very admiring of Peter, and that's why he read Girard's magnum opus, Things Hidden.
Yeah.
And when I was dealing through sort of personal issues, suffering through the pitfalls and vicissitudes of desire, if you will, Girard really helped me, and that's why I became so interested in his theory. But I initially got into it because of Peter. And usually people come and say, oh, there's no value in this work. You only like it because Peter likes it. However, for almost every other theory, that is a damning critique. But that's also exactly what mimetic theory sort of says, right? So you either have to say, mimetic
it's
theory
either right or
value,
it's not right.
Right.
Yeah.
You either have to say, well, mimetic theory has value, and that's the end of the conversation, right? It has value. Or you say, mimetic theory really has no value, Johnathan. But the only reason you think it has value is because Peter thinks it has value.
One of the things I really like about the idea of mimetic theory is it does seem like there's this real truth in it. Like anyone I know who spent more than 20 minutes kind of thinking about it, in the end, kind of like, wow, this is, some people might think there's a more magnitude than other people or something like that, but almost everyone really does kind of buy into like, there's a truth there.
I think so. Yeah. And I would say that, maybe not contra Girard, because he wouldn't claim otherwise, but to sort of tame my sort of passion for a bit, I would say that a lot of Girard's observations that people really like, essentially the mimetic psychological components that relate to people's everyday lives, that has mostly been said elsewhere. So there's the French tradition with Rousseau and his idea of amour propre, the desire for, essentially recognition, broadly conceived. There's the German tradition with Hegel and everything he says about recognition. And of course, there's the Scottish moral tradition of Hume and Smith, right? Smith had this very famous idea of the impartial spectator. So I would say that, yes, what you said is right, that I think there's some truth here, but a lot of it has been said before.
Yeah. Yeah. And as we get into some of the other stuff is maybe a little bit more new as well. Now, as you mentioned, kind of, there's also a point where the interest in Girard itself is mimetic.
Of course,
and people get interested in because other people are interested, and certainly that's the way you and I kind of got interested in because other people were interested in it. And do you think like a lot of these things, do you think, and it's hard to say since you're kind of knee deep in it, but do you think the interest is something you think will be enduring, or do you think like a lot of these things are just short-term fads, and they, kind of go in and out of style?
That's really interesting. I think if you were to ask Girard, if you were still alive today, and you ask him about the reception of his work, I think he'd be a bit disappointed. because frankly, I think he had made some really significant contributions in his first work, Desire to Seed in the Novel. And then when he turned more towards Christianity, I think a lot of the, especially the French academic community, sort of tried to distance themselves away from it. So Girard would probably respond to your question to say, this is being a fad already. Like I'm not big enough yet.
Right.
You see what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
the second thing
Still
I'll
more
probably
people
say,
have those
right?
$300 white t-shirts.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. The second thing I'll probably say is, I don't think this idea, or rather, let me put it this way. I don't think people should be ashamed of getting into things because of metaphysical desire, because you don't really have any experience of the object itself before you get into it. And
Yeah.
you see this with almost everything else, right? Like being a founder, for example. I mean, so many of my friends in their early college years wanted to be founders because it was the cool thing. And obviously,
Yeah.
they had no idea what running a company was like. Now, some of them, experienced it. They didn't like it. They left. Some of them stayed on, and their sort of pride and ego and metaphysical desire eventually calmed down because they just genuinely liked the day-to-day of running a company and stayed. So I actually think that this is quite a reasonable developmental picture for most things that we do, right? We were sort of attracted to some kind of prestigious thing. And for those who stay, many times it's that prestige wanes off and we find something more genuine underlying.
And do you think is it necessarily a bad thing that these type of desires motivate us to do things? Because in some ways it's just being human.
Yeah, totally. I mean, there's so much to say here. Girard himself would say that mimesis is fundamentally a good thing because it's about openness between humans, right? It's also the channel which sympathy proceeds through. And to your point, that's exactly. I think you hit it on the head by saying that that's what makes it human. Like, I think Girard would, to those people who'd say, "Oh, we just gotta stop being mimetic," I think Girard would say, you really haven't understand my theory there. Like we're so it's like saying like to a bird, you need to stop flying.
Yeah.
It's so constitutive to what we are that it's like, what does it even mean to, it's like just be a unmarried bachelor. Oh, sorry, being a married bachelor, right?
Yeah.
You're like, I'm just giving up the idea of what being a human is. Maybe one tangent that I'll perhaps lend some credence to this idea is, I was reading this popular book called Sapiens about a few years ago.
Yeah, great book.
Yeah, and in it, it's described how Homo sapiens won against Neanderthal and Homo erectus. And one of the hypotheses that it put forward is that Neanderthal and Homo erectus, they could only organize up until a certain limit. I don't know if it's still Dunbar's limit, but let's say it's 200 or something like that. But humans, because of our ability to create myths, to create fictions, to create things that don't really exist, we can suddenly organize across seemingly infinite number, right? And think about it, like all the gods that have come before, like the Egyptian gods, like Ra, where everyone agrees didn't exist. That was the grounding force of an entire sort of multi-millennia long civilization. And think about our current, financial system today and the faith we have in money and our banks. Well, maybe not so much our banks right now in Silicon Valley, but, I think mimesis is fundamentally instrumental to what makes us humans.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that some humans spend time building things that would never be completed anywhere near their lifetime. They're building these like great cathedrals that took hundreds and hundreds of years to create. I just think it's amazing that someone even got started doing that.
Yeah.
You have to really believe in something bigger than yourself.
That's right. So, this all goes back to your point of, it's more about how do we deal with mimesis rather than sort of, is it a bad thing that we are mimetic?
Now, one of the things I heard you talk about from Girard is kind of our propensity sometimes to turn social interactions into zero sum and sometimes even negative sum interactions when maybe there could be positive sum. Can you unpack that a bit?
Yeah, no, I think this is one of the really interesting aspects of Girardian theory because, I think our modern views of humans are extremely myopic, that we're sort of rational, utility maximizing creatures, right? If you take this Platonic ideal, the tripartition of the soul, reason, appetite, and spirit being, the part that desires glory, social belonging, I think we've completely sort of like ejected and cut out spirit. And we just think of ourselves as using reason to satisfy our appetites.
Uh-huh.
And so in that world, right, many things do seem positive sum. Many things, right? Cooperation between markets. If you're a podcaster, I'm a podcaster, your following grows up and we're friends, well, some of that is going to trickle to me because we do collabs. I should feel happy. But as all of us know, any of us who are competitive, prideful, that one of the hardest things to bear are those who are close to us who succeed.
Yeah, seeing your friends do well.
Seeing your friends do really well. It's
yeah.
really hard. And you know, this sort of rational utility maximizing view of human nature, it can't make sense of that at all, right? If my friend is a better investor than I, well, that's great because I'm going to get better deal flow. If my friend has a better startup than I, well, great, I can learn management lessons from him. You know, if my friend is David Perel and he has 300,000 followers and he's going to help me promote my Girard lectures, well, that's not how we treat these things, or that's not how often we treat these things. And that's not a modern perversion either. I think it was in his Nicomachean Ethics that Aristotle said, we fear our friends become gods. And so the question is, why is this? And so it's actually a bit stronger than even what you said. It's not just our ability to turn things into negative sum, zero sum games. It's our ability to turn positive sum games into negative sum.
Yep.
And Girard's explanation here is because not only do we desire appetite and utility, that's physical desire, but we also desire being. And Girard's conception of being is very exclusionary. So like, I mean, trivially and generally, you can understand it as a desire for maximum amount of recognition, right? Or to be the greatest X.
Yep.
Now, if you want to be the greatest X, then anyone who is also doing well at X is going to be threatening to you. Do you see what I'm trying to say? So it's not that we can't share, we can't grow together, we can't in the material world have positive sum games, but it's within this realm of spirit and identity and self-conception that a lot of what are supposed to be positive sum games, like sharing followers, sharing deal flow, really become negative sum because it's about, it's about competing in this sort of social status realm.
In this new world that we live in, so much of status is driven by how much attention is given to you. So if more people are reading my tweets, etc., and given that there's a finite amount of attention, you could see where maybe some of this comes in, or do you think that's too far afield?
No, I think that's right. Although in that world, right, what you just described, competing for attention, that is sort of zero sum because to your point, and we're turning it zero sum. But my point is there are positive sum games that we also turn negative sum. Right, like for example, two venture funds sharing deal flow. Maybe that's not a great example because it's somewhat competitive. But okay, here's a really innocuous one: lifting. Right, if you and a friend are all having a lifting goal, and that's clearly not zero sum or negative sum, right? And your friend hits it and you don't, you're going to feel really weird and upset about that. Worse than if neither of you hit it. Right. So that would be the example where a positive sum or at least zero sum gets turned into a negative sum game.
And there's these status games between people where there's a lot of signaling, and it seems like the elites of our society are playing that game as much, sometimes even more than everybody else, even though like maybe in some ways they've made it, etc. Why do you think these elites feel so insecure that they have to continue to play that game?
That's a great question. I think there's actually two questions there. One is that what about being an elite makes you insecure? And the second question is, what about being insecure makes you an elite? And because I think the causality flows both ways. To the first question, I would think that Girard would say, and again, this continues his attack of the individual, that our characters are indubitably shaped by the social environment that we're in. So if we're an elite, and even if we're a very sober elite, but we, all of our friends are in Hollywood, I don't know, like buying bottles every night or New York and doing crazy stuff, some of that is going to rub off to us. And so there's something about the environment of elites that's probably make people insecure. But the sort of converse, I think, is also true, where if you're naturally insecure, and keep in mind the proportion of metaphysical desire you experience is basically the delta between your pridefulness and your insecurity.
Yeah.
So the more prideful you are and the more insecure you are, the more sort of you're looking towards other people to get sort of normative certainty. And so, you know, trivially off the top of my head, I might say the more insecure you are, the more motivation you have to pursue status objects. And if you have status objects, then you become an elite, right? So I think the causality works both ways, probably.
And how do you think these things affect our belief? Like Eric Thornberg, a common friend of ours, he said that, he says our beliefs aren't about truth. They're about tribal membership. We don't actually believe this particular, let's say it's a political belief. We don't actually really believe this political belief. It's that we want to belong to this tribe, and that helps us believe that. How do you unpack that? And almost nobody listening to this podcast would believe it. Everyone says if they're for gun control, it's like no. I'm definitely. It's like it's not because I want to. It's like I've studied the issue and I know it's the best thing, right? So how would you unpack that?
Yeah. So the first thing I'll say is I don't want Girard to be painting a too unrealistic and pessimistic nature of a picture of human nature. He certainly isn't saying, we can't escape the group whatsoever.
Yep.
He's saying it's very, very difficult. People underestimate how difficult it is. And specifically, he highlights specific scenarios in which reason is least possible. And ironically enough, it's when reason is most needed that it's least available. I can elaborate on that. But to answer your question directly, the core insight of mimetic theory, in addition to some of the other thinkers that I brought up, like Hegel, or one of the core insights I would say is this: the relationship between man to object really is a relationship of man to man. And what I'm trying to get at there is, this idea of metaphysical desire that we talked about, right? When I desire this beautiful woman who just got a new suitor, it really is about my competition with that suitor.
Yeah.
So in this case, my relationship of man to object, in this case, a potential partner, is determined by relationship of man to man, right? And the same thing with maybe closing a big round, getting a really high valuation in your startup. That what you're really after isn't the valuation, it's what the valuation says about you relative vis-a-vis the social world. And so once you apply that general form, that relationship of man to object really reveals a relationship of man to man, I think what you just described, it flows naturally, right? That i.e. replacing truth for object there. So even in the domain of knowledge, a relationship of man to object, man to truth, is really about a form of relationship of man to man. Again, Girard doesn't think that this always has to be the case, but he thinks that's a strong tendency that are inflamed in important areas. Yeah.
Now, Girard also has this theory that there's a point where society can be like kind of spinning out of control. And the only way to get equilibrium is to offer up some sort of scapegoat. And in our modern world, what type of scapegoats do you think we are starting to have today?
It's so hard to tell. And part of the reason why it's so hard to tell is because the scapegoat mechanism is supposed to be this not completely random process. There's a form of logic to it, but the selection of victims is supposed to be arbitrary because it's supposed to be deceitful.
Yep.
And so it's very hard to tell, but let me put it this way. The scapegoat mechanism it doesn't have to be this society-wide calamitous event. It could be as simple as, a company not performing well and the board wanting to fire someone just to feel like they're doing something or just to have someone to blame. And so, I suppose there's too many examples where
in that case, when the board fires the CEO or something like that, there is a good chance that the CEO probably did have a lot to do with the company not working. Whereas in the kind of more traditional scapegoat, when society is, when they're actually they're often picking someone who's completely innocent and maybe not even involved in that. They're somewhat involved in the society, but they're not like integrated completely into the society. And by killing that person, or in the extreme version, or somehow banishing that person, there's more cohesion in the society.
Right. Well, so you were correct, I think, in everything but one
Okay.
important detail, which is the victim. The victim's guilt is a lie, but it's a lie in degree and not kind. And what I mean to say is the victim usually is innocent. Usually is guilty, but it's the degree of that guilt that is deceitful. Does that make
Okay.
sense? So,
Yeah.
for example, the canonical example is Sophocles, Oedipus, right? And the story of Oedipus is that there was a plague in Thebes, and they were like, well, who did this? Was the killer of Laius, the last king who did this? Well, who's the killer of Laius? It turns out it's Oedipus, right? The current king.
Yeah,
Laius happened to be his father,
and
he had sex with his mom. So patricide and incest. And when you read that, and Girard used that as one of the canonical examples, the scapegoat mechanism, you're like, where's the lie, right? Because I mean, it's clear, at least from the play, that he did kill his dad and have sex with his mom. So,
but not knowingly.
Not knowingly, but also the real lie is that it is this sentence, that the killer of Laius is responsible for the plague.
Right.
That's the lie. Like,
that's
blaming all of the calamity of Thebes on one patricidal act.
Right.
That is the lie. Do you see what I'm trying to say here? So it's not like Oedipus was completely innocent. Yeah. Right. In fact, his tragic flaw, I think, is his desire to know, or I don't know what the scholarship says, but it's the degree of that, right? So for example, what's a contemporary example of this? Oh, I think Zuckerberg has been scapegoated quite a bit. Maybe not recently, but
social networks in general.
Social networks
seem to be, at one point, at least a few years ago, it's like we're going to blame all of society's ills on social networks.
Right. And you're like, well, there's a lot of problems with social networks, right?
Yeah.
But all of it, really? And here's another example that I mentioned in the lecture series, which is a sort of another intellectual scapegoating, I think, is Marx. Right? When you read Marx, Capital, on the Jewish question, Estranged Labor, I think it's super compelling. But then you ask yourself, are these issues of alienation, exploitation, is this capital or is this human nature?
Right.
So like, are you? And indeed, capitalism
is the channel by any other system. Right.
Capitalism is by which these pathologies are channeled, but is it the root cause? I mean, it might inflame some of them. So you see how the scapegoat mechanism is not just the pure form that we usually think it is. Like a society gets mad, kills one person, gods are created. It's this more general form of sort of putting slightly undeserved blame onto a person, or sometimes extremely undeserved blame onto a person, and then expelling them, and then gaining a sense of cathartic release. Everything's now going to be okay. A wiping of the slate. So
how do you think of AI as a scapegoat today? It does seem like AI is starting to come up in lots of little types of things and lots of little excuses and stuff like that.
Yeah. I haven't thought about it that much. I definitely think it's true. I mean, one I think perhaps a bit too uncharitable reading, I'm not saying I agree with this, this is something I've heard, is that the AI risk people are really sort of using this as a way to sort of advance their career, or like get a lot of funding or something. Because this is the appeal of apocalypticism, right? Whereas if you claim that you're trying to solve the apocalyptic issue, be it AI or climate change, and that's kind of a trump card for everything, right? And that's the appeal, I think, of apocalypticism in the time of Jesus, as Girard talks about a lot as well, is that once you claim you have this sort of binary outcome and then you hold the keys to it, that lends you a form of moral superiority.
And power, right?
And power. And so I think Girard is naturally somewhat quite suspicious of all of these things, because they provide you so much power.
It's also interesting because a lot of times when people are there's also this Cassandra side of it too, right? Like, I'm going to point out these problems. And of course, like, every once in a while, the Cassandra is correct.
Right. Yeah.
But probably like 99 times out of 1,000, they're not correct. And then if the Cassandra is eventually right, if someone was saying that this bank is going to collapse or something many months ago, and then it was correct. They get a lot of credibility where they may have said that thousands of times in the past, and it didn't turn out to be correct, and people don't necessarily remember.
Yeah, there was I think, prophet guru who predicted that JFK would be assassinated, and of course she became super famous. But then she also made predictions of getting divorced, and that didn't pan out. So it seems like it's a numbers game.
Yeah, and it's also interesting when people climate change is, to me, very, very interesting. Where if you really believe climate change is going to really devastate the world, as many people do, then the answers to actually solving it aren't plastic straw banning or something like that. Like those are these tiny little 0.001% thing on the margin. The answers are huge, big things which are going to cost trillions of dollars to go do, and you should be putting all your effort on these massive things and not the little things on the margins.
Right. Yeah. That's
so you can tell that they're more likely signaling when you're proposing answers that don't actually solve the end problem. Assuming the person's smart, I would say.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah.
What after reading Girard, what makes you optimistic about humanity?
Well, perhaps we should explain the premise behind that question to our listeners who might not be as familiar, which is that Girard is a deeply apocalyptic thinker. In fact, famously in his last book, Bowing to the End, some people don't read this way, but I read it this way, where he basically thinks it's over. That sort of the way I put it is, we're headed onto this accelerationist path, and we have the kingdom of God or violent apocalypse ahead of us. And the issue is that while the kingdom of God, so what the kingdom of God is going to require is for all of us to essentially sing kumbaya and give up our violent initiatives in a sort of unilaterally, and it has to be unilaterally, right?
Yeah.
Because if everyone but one person gives up the gun, the guy with the gun is going to win.
Yeah.
And I think Girard would say that, that's a metaphysical possibility. It's like it's technically possible, but it's a statistical impossibility. It's as if expecting a monkey sitting down in a chair would sort of type out the Bible in his first try or something like that. But to answer your question directly now, of what makes me optimistic, I suppose it's the fact that I don't really agree with a lot of Girard's conclusions that makes me optimistic. I mean, I think Girard over indexes a lot on spirit, right? This sort of inflamed part of ourselves that we've been discussing. And I don't think he gives enough room for the power of reason. In fact, I just met a friend who's a Girard scholar who's working on this exact work to articulate what sphere reason has in sort of Girard's work. And I mean, you see this all the time, right? People often don't tribalistically pick sides. People don't, fire the first one fire the first person that comes into their site and can talk through things through reason.
Yep.
And so probably what makes
do you think we're better or worse at that as a society than we were in the past?
Oh, that's a tough one.
Like, are these tools, obviously there's a lot been written about and there's a lot of discussion about it. In some ways that'd be going forward that we're better, but then there's other things like technology acceleration and other where you would think it could rev up competitive mimetic desire, which could go the other way.
Yeah, it's really hard to tell. I mean, I think the Girard's answer would be both. We're both extremely better and extremely bad at it. And to make sense of that claim, he says something like, the world is both the best and the worst that has ever been. And it's true, right? The world is the best where it's ever been, where there's international law of some form, at least stronger than any other form that we've seen before. There's the aid to sort of developing nations.
Yeah, this idea of human rights.
Yeah, human rights, charity being as popular as it is. And however, for Girard, I think violence is just lurking right behind the surface. And I think that the term he uses is suspended polarity. Like two magnets that haven't touched yet, but
Yeah.
you're actively pulling them apart. There's a lot of potential energy built up. And I don't think that's too crazy. I mean, reading Girard has definitely made me more apocalyptic. I don't think as apocalyptic as Girard himself, but it's definitely made me see that sort of apocalypse, violent apocalypse, where the end of civilization as we know it is closer
Do you think
than most people
Girard's
think.
observation is universal, or does it more mimic like Western society as opposed to, let's say, Asian society or other types of societies?
His observation on what? On human nature or on
Yeah.
his trajectory of
Yeah.
history?
On human nature.
Okay, so on human nature, he would say across the board.
And what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think I suppose the other view, if I don't think that, I would have to think that the races are sort of fundamentally different.
Well, there could be a cultural thing
okay,
as well, right?
right.
Because you could say like there's a more individualist culture and there's a more collectivist culture, right?
That's why I asked, are you talking about his claims on human nature? So
Yeah.
on human nature, what I took that to mean is like the human firmware that things run
Got
on.
it. Okay.
And there
Yeah.
he means to say, I think all cultures are, you know, all humans are de facto
Yep.
very, very similar. We can treat them as the same. But in culture, of course, it spans a very wide spectrum. In fact, he's a shameless, I think, Westerner, and he's proud of it. And I think that's why the Academy does not like him, because he affirms the superiority of Christianity against all the other religions, and he affirms the culture that came out of Christianity. Because, right, and let me tie this together for some of our listeners who might not be as familiar. The scapegoat mechanism that we just discussed of the group gang upon one individual, Girard would say that is the origin of sacrifice, and that's why, you know, so many of the pagan religions and a lot of the Eastern religions are so violent in nature. But Girard would think that Christ actually sacrificed himself in some way to reveal that, right? And that's the form of Christ's story, that it's told from the perspective of the victim. It's about the guilt of the mob, right? And you know, I think Girard must think that the culture that comes out of that is in a privileged position. Although, with that said, I will say that Girard probably also wouldn't disagree with the idea that cultures can be Christian without explicitly being Christian. So there are certain ideas that are
like human rights. Human rights
exactly.
It's kind of infected all of society at this point, right?
And even individualism, I would say, right, through Western media, for example.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Now, like many people, let's say 15 years ago, I tried to really get into Girard and read Girard, and I found his books and his writings very, very hard to decipher. When I listened to your lecture series or some other people who wrote like these very, very great summaries, it's much more clear. But his writing just seemed to be incredibly opaque and incredibly inaccessible for the average person. Do you agree? And was he purposefully bad at it, or was he, or was it just like that? Just he wasn't the greatest communicator,
right? So I definitely don't think that he was purposefully doing that. There are people who purposefully do that. In fact, Girard critiques them. He says that clarity is not in fashion these days, and what he means is that
like an Alan Greenspan who like is purposely trying to.
I don't know. I was thinking more like Hegel or Adorno, but perhaps Greenspan as well. And his point is that, you know, in the last maybe 300 years, there's been a series of incomprehensible writers that who have made being incomprehensible prestigious in some spheres. And so people just compete in their writing style of making it, you know, Adorno, I think, proudly declared that his essays should be read as a atonal symphony. Now, if you listen to the atonal symphonies, you know that they're incredibly hard to decipher. and Adorno said that each sentence was equidistant from the thesis. Imagine that, like each sentence in his essay was equidistant to the thesis. Of course, that's not how you structure a clearly communicated essay. Right? You do thesis and you do your arguments, and and so that's clearly not. So that there's one that he sort of is aware and makes fun of people who do that, and two, he admits that he's not the greatest communicator in many interviews. So he's definitely not trying to be incomprehensible. But maybe in terms of your broader question of does it have to be incomprehensible? I don't think there has to be incomprehensible. However, I think that there is a fundamental trade-off between accessibility and maybe the profundity of an idea.
I guess, do you think like there could be all this other of life's wisdom, which is locked in this difficult to understand prose somewhere. And then we need people like you to go unlock it for us, who are willing to go through. I mean, I imagine it was very, very arduous to go through all these books and just go through one by one. And, or maybe we can have AI synthesize it in the future or something. Like, how do you think about that?
Yeah. So my point is, you're familiar, of course, with the production frontier, right? The trade-off, the fundamental economic idea that, if you can make 3 shoes and 1 cheese, or you can make 2 shoes and 2 cheese, and one shoe or 3 cheese. But there's a trade-off. And, if you're making only 1 shoe and 1 cheese, there's Pareto efficient leaps you can make. I kind of think writing is like that, where there are some ideas that are so complex that you can only make it so accessible. Okay. So there's a fundamental trade-off. However, with that said, I would say most ideas are not pushed to the frontier yet. Do you see
not even close. It doesn't
not even
like,
close. Yeah. And in fact, and this is going to go off a tangent, but I think the lecture format itself actually breaches that frontier in a very interesting way, because I still think you can capture the idea, but it's much more accessible being a lecture. But to answer so I hope I answered your question. And there's another interesting thing here that I've been toying with, which is I tend to think that bad writing can be good in many ways. And what I mean by that is, when the writing is really bad, there's no pretense of clarity. So you as the reader need to do a lot of work. When I'm reading, and for example, this is why I like poetry over prose fiction.
Yep.
It's because poetry does not have the pretense of being easily digestible. So when I'm reading, for example, Dante, I'm forced to think about what he's saying.
Yeah.
But if I'm reading, I don't know, Game of Thrones, or Pride and Prejudice, things can just fly away. So the bad writing,
it's kind of like probably most people are listening to this podcast at 2x speed right now.
Exactly. Right.
And they're just kind of like bringing it in, and it might be going in one ear. Whereas like for certain things, you have to listen to it at 0.5x speed.
Yeah,
and you have to re-listen over and over again.
Right. And so and because of the effort you have to exert to access some ideas, I think you feel also a bit more attached to it, right?
Yeah.
To your point, like, throughout all of college, I basically just locked myself in a room and read Girard's entire corpus. And, I sacrificed a lot, essentially. I mean, it didn't come off a sacrifice, but
there's
now I'm more identified. Now I'm more identified with it. I'm more attached to it, right? So
there's an anecdote at Thinking Fast and Slow, the Kahneman book, where he talks about the study they did in Princeton, where they had this kind of very hard to read copies of some things, and you had to kind of struggle, like the copy wasn't so good, the text wasn't that clear, and then the memorization of those facts later when they tested people was way higher. So if you had to struggle to get it, it was it was the only thing you could do. Yeah. So you really had to focus on that. Whereas other times you had other types of sensory things that would happen.
And in fact, I purposefully make my reading, even when it's reading quite accessible books in philosophy, difficult, where I force myself to sort of reconstruct the arguments. I actually have an essay about how I read, and that people can read on my website. But so that I'm agreeing with you, and I'm saying that's so true that I often try to make things more difficult so that I digest them a bit better.
Now, you can't study Girard without studying Christianity. I imagine you weren't like an expert in Christianity before you started this process. Like, what do you appreciate about the Christian religion that maybe you didn't before diving into Girard?
That's a big question. So first of all,
that's what you get on World of DaaS,
Yeah. First of all, I'm certainly not an expert yet. What do I appreciate of it? I think I came from somewhat of a rationalistic upbringing, and I dismissed many religions very offhand, de facto. But I think Girard showed me that there is a literary reading to the Bible where it could be true. So I don't think he's convinced me, so to speak. In fact, I don't think it was his intention that he thought just pure reason could convince people. But I think he's definitely opened it up for me, and made me see a lot of the phenomenal things that it has to offer. But maybe I'll ask a slightly different question, or rather answer a slightly different question, which is why I'm not a Christian after reading Girard. After all, I agree with so many of his things, like mimesis, and there's other things I don't agree with, like his views on reason, for example. I'm kind of caught in between, perhaps a rock and a hard place is not the right metaphor, but I've been exposed as both a practitioner and somewhat as an intellectual to, I think, two great religious traditions, one in Buddhism and one in Christianity. I was somewhat of a practicing Christian growing up. I practiced in a Buddhist monastery in just for a few months in Nepal during college, and I engaged somewhat with their intellectual traditions. And my issue is that both of them were so convincing and consistent internally.
Yeah.
That I'm kind of caught between like two goods, if that makes sense.
They're both
right?
great. They both look great.
Exactly.
Yes,
and I feel like if I were a Chinese person in 17th century imperial China, or if I was a European in 17th century Europe, it would be quite easy. If the choice was between atheism and Christianity or Buddhism, easy, right? And then I'll have the luxury of believing that, Christianity is this thing that only the barbaric white people practice, or Buddhism is only this thing that the Orientals practice. But now, because I was exposed, to both of them, I think it's really made me see how so many people choose make religious decisions in the same way that how we discuss people make political decisions based off of social reasons.
Yeah.
They just hang out with a lot of Christians, and it's the same thing with
or
the
you're
Buddhists.
born into it, and
you're born into it. Yeah,
you might slightly move around, right? You move from one Protestant denomination to another one, or something like that. But usually you don't go. Most people aren't super radical from one to another. Though I guess a lot of people who grew up religious become atheist, or so maybe they do get a little bit more radical there.
So that's really why he might not have had the full force that he would have wanted to have on me. But
okay, how do you think, how do you think we can think about whether it's mimetic theory or other types of things in the context of like running a startup or running a technology company? So many of our kind of listeners are in that mode.
Yeah, and as you introduced me, I'm on the founding team of a fintech startup myself, and I have to deal with a lot of this. And maybe let me start with a personal story, which is, I think for the first year of building the startup, which is also the first year that I actually graduated and started working, I had the wrong view of what it meant to be a leader in a startup and to build something. I thought it was just the college view, right? Let me just crank out as much human work as humanly possible, as fast as possible, and as quality as possible. And so I would, push people maybe beyond what is comfortable in delivering things in terms of deadlines. And then I realized that, as a leader, and certainly as a founder, what you're really building is you're assembling a sort of social group of people to do great work.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's been a fundamental change that I think is Girardian through and through. Maybe let me be a bit more specific as well, which is, again, one of the insights I think Girard teaches us is that humans are not completely, at least, appetitive and reason asking creatures, right? It's not just you dangle the sort of 20x in front of them in their equity, and you give them a high salary that they'll be happy. People are motivated by things like rivalry, status, prestige, the narrative, right? Why they're doing it, why the thing that they're doing matters. And I think, those, when you emphasize those aspects, when you start looking at people not as rational robots, but as spirited social animals, I think you become a much more effective manager and navigator in the startup realm. And maybe one more thing that I'll say is, before you have product market fit before you can scale and use quantity to essentially guide your business and anchor discussions, I think you as a founder must spin up these platonic noble lies, or to put another way, even if you don't have certainty in something, you can't reveal it because you are the sort of mimetic orbit in the company, and everyone is going to imitate your sort of belief or disbelief in a certain thing.
In fact, that's true at any stage, not only in a company, but a
Yeah.
nation or organization. At any stage, there has to be these, I don't know if you want to call them lies, but these myths that we all have to believe into that are way bigger, that are unprovable, that likely won't become true,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Otherwise, people won't give it their all in any type of thing. Or do you disagree?
I know, I totally agree. Yeah. In fact, one of my favorite essays, some of our listeners might be interested, is by Nietzsche. He published a series of essays called or it was grouped into a series of essays called Untimely Meditations. And one of them was called The Uses and Abuses of History for Life. And he basically articulated how there's no real objective way to do history, collecting facts, because no matter what you do, you have to choose, you have to synthesize, you have to decide on what is causality and what isn't causality in history, right? Like if you read Analects of the Grand Historian, Shiji in China, they would say, oh, there was this sign from heaven and therefore there was a drought here. Right. So there's no way to do objective history. Like when you read history, you need to give a causal explanation. And there you're postulating a philosophical worldview. And so Nietzsche's point essentially is you should not lie necessarily, but construct the narratives and histories that serve you. So he said, look, if you're a critical activist, then maybe you conceive of history as a long fight against oppression. If you're a antiquarian, or if you're a monumentalist, right? Someone who believes in the great man history, then maybe you just think about history as a series of, great men, one after the other, pushing history forward. So, and I think this applies to what you're saying in the organizations as well, which is like, I don't think it goes to I like what you said about it not being provable. So it's not a direct lie. It's not like, I have 12 months of runway and say I have 24 months of runway. Right. It's more like saying, what we're going to do is going to be very important for the world.
Yeah.
Right. And
that is a statement the world.
It's going to change the world, or So it's things like that. Perhaps normative.
It's not that often like a SaaS company changes the world.
Right. So I agree with you. Yes.
Okay. Interesting. Now, if I wanted to be, or our listeners wanted to become a less negative sum, less zero sum, more positive sum, how would you advise us to kind of maybe go against some of our internal nature and become, let's say, more quote unquote enlightened? Yeah,
well, the first question I would ask back to someone asking me that is whether you would want that. If, for example, I've felt that I've needed to tap into more mimetic tendencies more.
I definitely want to tell people that I want that, because then they might think better of me.
Right. So maybe we cut off this part and don't air it. But to share my own demon, so to speak. So at the end of my college, I was deciding between doing philosophy PhD, going to a Buddhist monastery, or building a company.
As all of us are usually with those grappling those three choices. Yeah,
I was probably least excited about building the company. Fortunately, I was introduced to Joe Lonsdale. That's a whole other story. We ended up building this. But as you can tell, my mindset there was very contemplative, right? It was very peaceful. As you said, it was freed from a lot of these things. But when I got into the world, I realized that in my stage of building the company, being mimetic and having those desires helped me in this stage, even if it's globally worse. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So like this is my joke. Augustine famously said, Lord, make me chaste, but not yet. Right. And I think my corollary to that is, Lord, make me avaricious, but only for a while. So, let me explain.
Yeah.
So a lot of my friends have a very strong desire for money. I don't have that strong of a desire for money, actually, for reasons we can discuss. But I found that if I meme myself into desiring money, whether it's telling myself getting money will help me get the girl I want, or I'm more motivated to build a company. Do you see what I'm trying to say? So that's the first question I think you have to ask. And especially if you're designing an organization, you really have to ask, do I really want to dial back this dial of mimesis. There's certain
Yeah.
areas, certainly, but there is a trade-off there. Now, to the question of how you can dial it back or how you can manage it. First of all, Girard is sort of speechless almost here. He famously does not want to give any prescriptions for either individuals or the world. But I think that there's generally two strategies. One is to align your physical and metaphysical desire. This would be like the artist, instead of going to MBA, dropping out and joining an artist commune, right?
Yep.
Where his social environment is now suddenly aligned with what he really wants to do. And the second one would be to reduce one's metaphysical desire. And as we discussed already, metaphysical desire is proportionate to your pride minus your insecurity, right?
Yeah.
So there's two levers.
Yep. There's two levers. Yep.
You can sort of push there. And the one of the ways to resolve this, Girard thinks, is to withdraw from society. And I think this ties into what I was discussing about how we're not individuals and we're sort of helplessly determined by our social environment. I think Girard thinks that there are certain social environments that no matter how strong of a character you are going to be contagiously infected and pulled into its gravitational orbit. So in many instances,
would that be every environment? I mean, you're going to be, I mean, we all are, we can't go to first principles on everything. We have to kind of trust. Part of being human is by trusting other people. I've never proven that the world is round to myself, right? I haven't gone to first principles on it, but I believe the world is round. It might be flat, but I believe it's round because so many of the other people around me have agreed that it's so
right.
It's this common belief that it's round. Yeah.
So the question is, what's the question exactly? Or maybe you were just adding to my point.
Well, I guess, yeah, I'm adding to your point that it's like, it's kind of impossible to break out. I mean, maybe the Unabomber broke out of it, but it's almost impossible for anybody who's actually trying to move around in society to not be infected by it.
Totally. And, the example I was going to give was contemporary politics, right? I think a lot of young people have very noble aspirations about how they're going to go in there, whether on the left or the right, and they're going to really change things.
Yeah.
And once they get in there, it's almost inevitably disappointment, leaving it, or becoming the very people that they very loathe, right? So the idea there is that there's social environments where, like, you can't be an individual. Like, when you get in those social environments, the sort of mimetic orbit will pull you in.
Yeah.
And I think, by the way, understanding Girard's theory, that's one of the big practical benefits of this theory, which is it's not like in the moment when you're already in the orbit, mimetic theory has nothing to offer you. Like, you're stuck. Learning this does not sort of make you less mimetic.
Yeah.
In fact, it might sort of make you more mimetic because now you feel a license, right? That you aren't like this. But I think what it does for you is that in the brief moments of sobriety, either before, after, or during being pulled into the mimetic orbit, it can help you see the signs earlier.
It's just learning. It's like learning about our cognitive biases in a way, right?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Yeah. Now, one question on kind of international politics and stuff. Girard kind of famously predicted that as the U.S. and China became more similar, that there would be more conflict between the two. And he didn't live long enough to actually see that happening. How do you think Girard can, through the lens of Girard, we can explain some of these big global tensions?
So what you're describing there is some of Girard's predictions in his last book, Battling to the End. And the reason he gives this is, again, it ties back to this idea of being negative sum. So a lot of the optimism between the Sino-American relations in the early 2000s was to say, well, the Chinese are going to be more happy because they're going to have better goods.
Yep, they're going to be richer. Yep.
And the Americans are happy because they're going to have cheaper goods.
Yeah.
And they're going to be richer, absolutely. And Girard said, wait, hold on. We're not rational, utility maximizing creatures. Our absolute increase in goods matters relatively little compared to the change in relativistic social standing. So as the Chinese get richer, they'll not feel happier, but they'll be more envious of the Americans, because envy is something that traffics more readily among similars.
Yep.
And as the Americans get richer through cheaper Chinese goods, they won't be happy about their absolute increase. They'll be concerned about their relative decrease with the gap. and that this will create a sort of paranoia that would lead both sides to spin up what Girard says is what he calls false differences, to things that don't really cause the conflict, but just banners to rally under. And you clearly see this in your own relationships, where people are fighting who are exactly similar, right? It's two founders bickering over an employee, and they're like, oh no, but I'm just, or his tactics are sort of but at the end of the day, they're doing the same things. And so it's that explanation for why Girard thinks that US and China are fighting. It's not because of Confucianism versus Plato. It's not because of liberal democracy versus communism. It's really because the two nations want the exact same things. And look, I don't fully agree with this, but I think there's probably some truth to this. If an alien were to come to the Earth and you asked them, what is the most similar nation to America? You probably say China, right? Similar landmass, similar GDP, similar grand historical ambitions, a sense of sort of importance in the world, similar importance given to education, similar technological and materialistic bent, a similar level of, frankly, atheism in both countries, right? A sort of focus on the material world. And so there's probably something to that. Yeah.
Interesting. All right, that's great. A couple personal questions. A lot of people have these like complicated feelings about child prodigies, and maybe they want their kids to excel, but also maybe they also want their kids to be, kids. Do you think there's like an optimal amount of competition or pressure for kids to experience growing up?
That's such a tricky question. In fact, I mean, I don't have kids now, and if everything goes well, I won't have kids for a while. But I have been thinking about this quite a bit. I'm very interested in rearing children. I really don't. I really could see it going both ways. For example, I've seen, in my own case, I grew up extremely competitive, just thrown into the most competitive environments you can imagine. And on one hand, it has made me very prideful and arrogant. But on the other hand, that pride and arrogance has been fully directed into quite productive things, whether it's my early training in math, eventual training in computer science, and current training in philosophy. That's a bit less mimetic. So as I told you in the beginning of this conversation, there's a very reasonable developmental picture to be told here, where look, kids don't really know what they like to do. They like no kid, or very little kids, very few kids are going to have an intrinsic motivation to study math. However, what kids do enjoy is beating other kids.
Yeah.
So if you put them in a math camp where they get to excel, maybe you can leverage their competitiveness into pursuing math and getting to a place of mastery where they can actually enjoy it. I mean, that's kind of my own development picture. But I don't know. I mean, that also ends up very terribly, right? That's how also how
Right.
you get like the career climbers. And so I don't know. I mean, I suppose, right, the ideal path is someone who's followed interest after interest after interest, and has excelled in all that. But to this day, I really haven't met anyone who's like that.
Okay, this is great. Last question we ask all of our guests: what conventional wisdom or advice is generally bad advice?
Yeah, I thought about this because you sent me over the questions. I think there's a whole line of thinking that tries to make us anti-mimetic individuals that I think is very counterproductive. So I think there was a book by Mark Manson, I think, Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck, or this common adage to say, don't care what other people think.
Yeah.
Or just be confident.
Yeah.
I think that is a symptom of not realizing how much of a social beings we are. So, if the naive position, what I mean to say is when someone tries to not care what other people think, what is almost always happening is that they want to come off as a person who doesn't care what other people think about him. They want other people to think about him as a person who doesn't care what other people think about him.
Yep.
And that leads to a very odd and funny, humorous kind of negative, what Girard called a negative species of mimesis. So everything we talked about today has been a positive species of mimesis. Not that it's good, but that sort of model and subject converge. Right?
Yeah.
That is essentially, I admire Auren, and whatever you do, I want to do.
Yeah.
But there's also a negative species, right? Where I don't like this person.
Yep.
And everything, and you can see this in politics, everything
happens all the time, right?
I am not.
Yeah, which is funny. You see that all the time in politics where it's like, I'm against this. Well, why? Oh, I'm against this because they're for it. Right.
Yeah,
Not
exactly.
necessarily because I'm against it. Right.
Right. And so that, I think, is almost always bad advice. I think the best thing to do, as Girard would say, is to keep the object in view. So if you're building a company, don't be innovative, be profitable.
Yeah.
If you're an artist, don't go for something original, go for something beautiful. If you're a philosopher, we're tying back our conversation. Don't try to say something unique. Try to say something that's true.
Yeah.
Right.
Wow, this has been great. Thank you, Johnathan Bi, for joining us on our World of DaaS. I follow you at Johnathan Bi, which is JOHNATHANBI on Twitter. And I encourage our listeners to engage with you there. Thank you so much.
Thanks, man.